Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 342. In this episode, we're continuing our journey through the fall of Númenor by exploring the chapter The Accession of Tar-Aldarion, wherein Númenor enters a new era of its history, led by the first of the great Sea Kings. Before we get started, I'd like to give a double up air five to our amazing fellowship. Stick 'em up, everybody. 3, 2, 1. Whoopsh. Very nice. Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., Melkor27, and KG. And a big thank you to our newest patron, Spencer M. Spencer, thank you so much for joining our fellowship. Also, a shout out to those celebrating their fellowship anniversary in July of 2023, Seb M, Matthew W, Werty, David of Pints with Jack, and Chris L. Thank you all so much for sticking with us over the years. Join the Fellowship of the Road by visiting patreon.com/TolkienRoad. When you join the Fellowship of the Road, it helps us to keep on evering on and land you some cool perks along the way. Learn more at patreon.com/TolkienRoad. And if you're watching, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. Finally, attention binge listeners, subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the platform of your choice. If you are a 5-star fan of the Tolkien Road, you can really help us out by heading over to iTunes or your preferred source for the show and dropping us a rating and review. When you do that, it helps to get the word out about the Tolkien Road, which helps us to keep on evering on. Thank you all so much. Well, let's dive in. This chapter concludes the era of Aldarion, one of the most important kings in the history of Númenor. As we learned in the last episode, his father, Tar-Meneldur, chose to turn the rule of Númenor over to Aldarion earlier than was normal, due to a letter from the Elven High-King Gil-galad, asking for Númenor's aid amidst the increasingly dire situation in Middle-earth. In this chapter, we'll explore Aldarion's reign, as well as what becomes of his wife Erendis and daughter Tar-Ancalimë. As with our last few episodes, this is a longer chapter than most of the Fall of Númenor chapters, so we'll only be hitting the high points. However, if you'd like a more in-depth discussion of the tale of Aldarion and Erendis, to include Greta's perspective, please check out the notes, or just go back and find episodes 183, 185, 186, and 187. The original source for this chapter is Unfinished Tales, The Mariner's Wife. Tar-Aldarion's rule spans 192 years, from Second Age 883 to 1075. Christopher Tolkien opens this chapter with a bit of background. To summarize, his father never completed the story, but instead wrote various snippets and sketches of what remained to tell. Still, we have a fairly decent outline of how things would have proceeded if the tale had been completed. First off, Aldarion becomes king and sets out for another voyage. Seems pretty appropriate for Tar-Aldarion, given what we know about Aldarion in general. The further course of the narrative opens with Tar-Aldarion's journey to Mithlond, or the Grey Havens, shortly after his accession. It says in the year or the year after he ascended to the throne, to the kingship of Númenor. So what do we know of his later voyages? Well, not really a whole lot, but we'll read a little snippet here to tell us something of what we do know. It is also stated that no records are now left of the later voyages that Tar-Aldarion made, but that it is known that he went much on land as well as sea, and went up the river Gwathlo as far as Tharbad, and there met Galadriel. There is no mention elsewhere of this meeting, but at that time Galadriel and Celeborn were dwelling in Eregion, at no great distance from Tharbad. But all Aldarion's labors were swept away. The works that he began again at Vinyalonde were never completed, and the sea gnawed them. Nevertheless, he laid the foundation for the achievement of Tar-Meneldur long years after, in the first war with Sauron, and but for his works the fleets of Númenor could not have brought their power in time to the right place, as he foresaw. Already the hostility was growing, and dark men out of the mountains were thrusting into Enedwaith. But in Aldarion's day the Númenorians did not yet desire more room, and his venturers remained a small people, admired but little emulated. So just to hit a couple of notes there, I want to share, first of all, where the couple of places that were mentioned here. So let's look at our map of Middle-earth. So what we see here is the map that we're probably familiar with from Lord of the Rings. And the locations that are mentioned here really are this section that's kind of halfway between this southern peninsula towards, southwestern peninsula towards the bottom of the map, and then the Grey Havens up towards the top. This river is the Gwathlo, which in later years is called the Grey Flood, and this region of Tharbad, where it's mentioned that Galadriel dwells, is here, sort of in the southern area of Eriador. Aldarion had done some work in his time to establish this haven of Vinyalande at the mouth of the Gwathlo Grey Flood River. So there are remnants of that in later times, but it didn't really take hold in a long and meaningful way. Nevertheless, Tar-Aldarion was a pioneer, and he did, really pioneer this relationship with the elves of bringing back Númenor to the west of Middle-earth. Now, back in Númenor, Aldarion's departure causes quite the stir. No king had ever departed Númenor during his reign, and in his place, Halatan of Hjarðardorni ruled as regent. Halatan had been the only member of the king's council who had approved of Meneldur's decision to resign the scepter to Aldarion. Therefore, we can understand why he was chosen. He was nearest of mind to Aldarion rather than the other lords of Númenor. So of all the lords of Númenor, he was nearest to the mind of Aldarion, apparently. Especially when it came to the importance of matters back in Middle-earth itself. Unfortunately, Aldarion's return to Middle-earth was not well timed. The chapter says it was too late, for the power that hated Númenor had already waked, and then it was too early, for Númenor was not yet ready for the battle that awaited anyway. Indeed, it would seem that Sauron chose his moment well, but more on that later. So let's talk a little bit about Anakalime, Aldarion's daughter, and only child. She grew up as we might expect, molded into a formidable personality by an upbringing which saw her pitted between two strong-willed parents. She did not seem to have chosen one side or the other, for it says, she approved, as it were, both Erendis' treatment of Aldarion on his late return, but also Aldarion's anger, impenitence, and subsequent relentless dismissal of Erendis from his heart and concern. So things are not at all happy on the home front, and Anakalime is getting to the age where she's able to really pick up on this and start to understand that. Much is said of Erendis' perspective that was imparted to Anakalime. This is a good summary that I've lifted from the text. Thus it is, Anakalime, and we cannot alter it. And these are Erendis' words, by the way. Thus it is, Anakalime, and we cannot alter it. For men fashion Númenor, men, those heroes of old that they sing of. Of their women we hear less, save that they wept when their men were slain. Númenor was to be a rest after war. But if they weary of rest and the plays of peace, soon they will go back to their great play, manslaying and war. Thus it is, and we are set here among them. But we need not assent. If we love Númenor also, let us enjoy it before they ruin it. We also are daughters of the great, and we have wills and courage of our own. Therefore do not bend, Anakalime. Once bend a little, and they will bend you further until you are bowed down. Sink your roots into the rock and face the wind, though it blow away all your leaves. However, she was perhaps innately more like her father, as is glimpsed in this passage. Anakalime, like her father, was resolute in pursuing her policies, and like him she was obstinate, taking the opposite course to any that was counseled. She does spend a good amount of time in Armenelos in her youth, and so becomes accustomed to her possible heirship. Now, more on that in just a bit, but I do want to make a quick comment on this, because one thing that you'll sometimes hear from some folks about Tolkien is that he was, he wrote very poor female characters. And I just think whenever I hear this argument or this accusation made towards him, it doesn't make much sense to me at all. In fact, all it really says to me is that the folks who are making these sorts of arguments have not really bothered to read much of Tolkien or to think very deeply, or that they're imposing their own views on Tolkien's writing. I, for one, think thinks he writes very well when it comes to the dynamics of the relationship between men and women. You have to recall, on one hand, that he's writing about a much earlier time, way back in the history, even we might say of the prehistory. He is trying to write something of a history of a fantastical time within our own world. But, it's passages like these when it comes to Erendis imparting her perspective to her daughter Ancalimë on the men of Númenor. I look at this and I say, he's really taking his time to write from a female perspective here. He is really taking his time, I think, to do it justice and to do justice to what her own claims and her own perspective might have been towards Aldarion, her husband. I think of other characters. This is not the only example, but it's just passages like these that really make me think. The criticisms in general that Tolkien does not, just has nothing to do with offering any kind of good insights into a feminine perspective. I just don't think those hold water at all. Now, you might take issue with how he does it. You might take issue with, things he says here or there. And, I'm not going to go down that road right now and getting into the details of all of that. But I just think this sort of passage right here, just says, like, it just makes, whenever I hear people say that he doesn't even bother, with female perspectives, I just think to myself, you haven't really read much Tolkien, have you? Or you're just kind of you're just kind of imposing that view on him instead of actually dealing honestly with what he's written. So there you go. That's my divergence into that topic for now. Perhaps we'll talk about that more later. I'm sure if we, there's plenty of other opportunities to talk about it, and we have dealt with it in other, in other episodes as well. All right. So enough of that excursus for now. Let's talk about the changing of the laws of succession, a not unrelated topic. In the Second Age, 892, when she is 19, Ancalimë is proclaimed the king's heir, and Tar-Aldarion causes the law of succession in Númenor to be changed. The new law, well, it's the eldest child of the ruler. So before it had to be a male heir, so it had to be it went always by the nearest male in line of descent in the line of Elros. But now Aldarion succeeds in changing the rules so that Ancalimë, his only child, can become the ruler of Númenor after him. But it's not really changed, to give an equal footing to women per se, to possible female heirs per se. Really, as I read it, it's just given the benefit if there is an eldest daughter of the king or queen, then they are the next ones to receive the rulership. I'm not even sure if another daughter would be, if a second daughter would be considered. It's not really clear on that point entirely. You can read it either way. But what's interesting is that beyond direct descent from the king, it's the nearest male kinsman of male descent from Elros that has the priority. So this is a bit confusing. The new law still very much favors male succession, even to a somewhat absurd extent, but at least makes exception for the eldest daughter of the ruler. So Ancalimë will be able to become the ruler of Númenor after Tar-Aldarion resigns or passes away. One other note, it's also decreed the following: the king's heir must only wed in the line of Elros. Now this seems to be a clear attack on Erendis by Aldarion. Indeed, the marriage of Aldarion and Erendis never heals, and only seems to become a greater source of bitterness over time. But this seems clear to kind of make this point that we want to keep it within this, sort of highest line of descent, the line of descent from Elros that's actually going to result in the longest lifespan. It's a very interesting note, like one that perhaps we could dive into. Some people might take a lot of issue with this. I don't know where I stand on it. I don't know what I would think about that. On one hand, I kind of understand the idea that, like, hey, in here we know for sure that people in the line of Elros actually live closer to 450 years. And if we start, allowing the king's line to enter, or the line of rulers to intermarry with these other lines, it will start to dilute that age range. Now, some people, I think would argue that sounds very, eugenicist, right? Which is something that, probably most of us are not very much a fan of. But I will say that right here, when we're just talking strictly about the king's line, there does seem to be something to this that maybe doesn't necessarily apply in actual reality, right? Your mileage may vary. I'm not sure where I stand on it, but I do think it's an interesting note, something to highlight here, and perhaps something to revisit at a later time. All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about Ancalimë specifically, and Ancalimë and this figure Mamandil. Ancalimë becomes annoyed by the approaches of various suitors, and so goes into hiding on a farm and secretly lives the life of a shepherdess. She falls in with a shepherd by the name Mamandil. We get a sketch of how a romance between the two developed and played out, with the result being that Ancalimë discovers that Mamandil is none other than Halacar, son of Halatan, also of the line of Elros. Though they will eventually wed, though it is not a happy marriage, I should put that this way. They will eventually wed, though it is not a happy marriage, mirroring to some extent the relationship of her parents. Authentic love and affection at the outset, strained by the realities of power, responsibility, and personal will. In some view, it is a marriage of necessity, both in order to beget an heir to the throne and to ensure the long reign of Ancalimë. Their only child is Anarion. Now, the last major bit of this chapter concerns what looks like it could have been a story or a longer set of chapters in the big story of Aldarion and Erendis. If it had been, become its own novel, it looks like this could have been a story in and of itself, of a couple of chapters, and it concerns this great wedding feast that is put on by Halacar. So essentially, it's a story that manifests their lifelong lovers' quarrel, the lifelong lovers' quarrel between Halacar and Ancalimë. It concludes with this ominous line. Well, and just before I get to that conclusion, really what it concerns is a marriage feast, a wedding feast put on by Halacar, not for himself and Ancalimë, but after they are married, for some of the queen's women whom she has forbidden to marry. And he wants to enable them to marry, and so he arranges this wedding feast and invites Ancalimë to it, and he kind of uses it to get back at Ancalimë for a lot of her bitterness and spitefulness towards him. And it ends with this ominous line: "Thus he was revenged, for she came never back to Emerie, where the very sheep seemed to make scorn of her, but she pursued Halacar with hatred afterwards." Again, another generation of Númenorian rulers is raised by parents with bitterness and hatred towards one another. This can't be good for the long-term health of Númenor. It's really going, you think about the first several generations of kings of Númenor, and we didn't get any note that they had unhappy marriages, that they were in marriages that resulted in this same kind of bitterness. So it's, even with Tar-Meneldur and his wife, they seem to be, every indication we have is that they were happy in their marriage together. They both accepted their roles, and that they were very happy with it. And we have no notes that say otherwise about the kings that came before. But starting with Aldarion and Erendis, things get bitter, ugly, nasty, and that has to have an effect on Ancalimë, their child, right? That has to do something to her psyche as she grows up to become the queen of Númenor later on. How she'll rule, the policies she'll set, the way she'll treat the people who are closest to her, and all of those things will ripple out into the culture of Númenor. So in a way, it's almost like Aldarion and Erendis and their relationship maybe is this first shadow over the people of Númenor. And it's really tragic that it then continues into Ancalimé's relationship with her husband, Halacar. Another kind of greater shadow cast over them. And it's perhaps perpetuated down through the generations, right? I'll be surprised if Anarion, the son of Ancalimë, is not somehow affected by this, and if it doesn't somehow play out in his policies, in the life he leads, in the way he rules. All of these things, these happenstances of various generations, they do have reverberations and echoes down through the generations, through later generations that follow. So, in all of this, I don't think it's insignificant. These details are insignificant. Tolkien never wrote that way in the first place. And second of all, if you know the end of the story of Númenor, you can maybe see how this is sowing these early seeds. But, a little more on that in just a moment. But let's read about this final word on Erendis here towards the end of the chapter. All right. Of Erendis, it is said that when old age came upon her, neglected by Ancalimë and in bitter loneliness, she longed once more for Aldarion, and learning that he was gone from Númenor on what proved to be his last voyage, but that he was soon expected to return, she left Emerie at last and journeyed unrecognized and unknown to the haven of Romena. There, it seems, she met her fate, but only the words Erendis perished in water in the year 985 remain to suggest how it came to pass. Of the lifespan granted the Númenorians, Erendis had once said that the women became a kind of imitation elves, and their men had so much in their heads and desire of doing that they ever felt the pressure of time, and so seldom rested or rejoiced in the present. Fortunately, their wives were cool and busy, but Númenor was no place for great love. I mean, that really just does such a great job of summing it all up. I mean, obviously, let's make explicit. It does sound like Erendis most likely committed suicide in the year 985. It doesn't say that explicitly, just says she perished in water, but that's at least the way I read it. It would not be surprising to find that, right? Surrendering in bitterness and loneliness to, her great foe, as she said in an earlier chapter, Uinen, right? The Lady of the Sea, right? Who she really probably feels like she lost her chance at love and her husband too. Very tragic ending, especially as it seems that perhaps she was trying to find some last reconciliation with Aldarion. It's interesting to think about how this story might have ended if Tolkien had completed it. There's a lot of possibility. I think it could have been a great standalone novel, perhaps not of the length of Lord of the Rings or even of the Silmarillion, but maybe a book of the similar length to what we now have of the Children of Húrin. A lot of just possibility with the various stories that are told here, and you can see you can kind of see it outlined in everything that Tolkien left to us and that Christopher collected in Unfinished Tales. But I do also think it's worth highlighting what's said about in this last bit here of the lifespan granted the Númenorians. Women become a kind of imitation elves, while the men, they still have like kind of the burning desire of men, like there's never enough time. Something I feel myself, and I'm not going to live anywhere near to the lifespan of the line of Elros. But even with their much longer lifespan, they still are just kind of like there's never enough time. There's never enough time. But the women, want to enjoy this extra time that's been given to them. So it said they become a kind of imitation elves, right? I know what she means there. But their men had so much in their heads and desire of doing that they ever felt the pressure of time. Númenor was no place for great love. What a tragic final word on, this story and the nature of Númenor, that they've been given this opportunity in this land to dwell and be happy for a much longer period of time as this reward. This beautiful land. It may not quite be paradise, but it's as close as you can get to paradise on earth for men. And it's no place for great love. Just a very tragic final word. And it's one that we'll leave the story of Erendis with. So I'd summarize the tale of Aldarion and Erendis by these key takeaways. With Aldarion, Númenor begins to transform from the land of rest and harmony that it had been in its first millennium into a realm oriented towards other realms. It is caught up in the affairs of Middle-earth and will never be able to divorce itself from them again. With the marriage of Aldarion and Erendis, a certain poison of bitterness and regret seems to enter into the line of Númenor's kings and queens as well. They seem to be jaded against the notion of happiness, the original promise inherent in Númenor's founding. As a consequence, their hearts become restless, and that is perhaps a seed of Númenor's eventual undoing. Next time, we'll catch up with events in Middle-earth, including an update on Sauron's doings around this time. Now that's about it for this episode. Please keep the correspondence coming. We'll do our best to respond to you somehow and at some point. And I'd like to give a shout out to our amazing patrons, especially the following: John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., Melkor27, KG, Emilio P, Jonathan D, Robert H, Paul D, Julia, Werty, JoeBagelMan, Richard K, Matt R, Matthew W, John W, Eugene D, Chris B, Daniel S, Seb M, Cory C, Carolyn S, Ms. Anonymous, Andrew T, Redhawk, Shannon S, Brian O, Zeke F, James L, Chris L, Azia V, Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C, David of Pints with Jack, and Eric B. All right. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our amazing fellowship. We really appreciate you. And thanks to everybody for watching and or listening. We will talk at you next time. Bye-bye.